So, David, I am very excited by your book because it gave a possible solution to something around which I've been turning for long. I see a great unity in our knowledge of the world. And we have an enormous amount of knowledge from all sorts of direction and fields. And we keep hearing about specialization and separation of. And I don't think this is right, because this knowledge is coherent, stays together. I'm a physicist, and I feel this unity of knowledge, and I've tried to present this unit of knowledge in some way. But as a physicist, it's a very bad position, because physics is, in some sense, one of the ground on which a lot of science relies. But it's a sense which is strongly contested and very politically incorrect in some sense. Now, I think that hierarchies are not alternative to one another. One can put order in different ways. And what you have found, seems to me, is a spectacular way to use history to put order in the entire set of our knowledge of the world. There is a way of connecting things to one another which is historical. This is wonderful. It's fantastic.
Well,
the question is, are there limitations in that? Because that's one perspective, one again. How do you feel about this? What's the strength and the weakness of this historical perspective on knowledge?
About 20 questions there. I'm not sure which I should answer, but I mean, first I think there's, C.P. Snow famously talked about the differences between the sciences and the humanities as like two different tribal cultures that couldn't understand each other. Now, I agree with you completely. I think there is no ultimate chasm between these worlds. It must be true, if reason means anything, that there is coherence between these worlds. But we find it very hard to see because we live in a world of extreme specialization academically. I think the specialization is in some ways more insidious in the humanities than in the natural sciences, because in the natural sciences there are big Kuhnian paradigms. So I think everyone understands that detailed specialist research is part of a larger project.
Yeah.
In some way. I mean, it may be criticizing it or it may be reinforcing that larger paradigm. In the humanities, we don't have paradigms. So, and this is what Kuhn famously said, so that as a historian, I more or less have to say to my students, this is how I approach history. So, you know, just suck it up. That's the way it's going to be. You're going to learn my way of doing, which is not the way science works. So historians, by and large, I think, because they live in this world, are, and many people in the humanities, quite resistant to the idea of a sort of large coherent story. And in fact, famously, the French postmodernist scholar Lyotard said, you know, we've learned not to mess with grand narratives or meta-narratives. Now, I'm going against the grain of that because I think there must be a grand narrative there, and we need to mess with it. We need to construct it carefully, because a bad narrative is indeed a very dangerous thing, and that was Lyotard's point, I think. But we can't live without good narratives. So I think it's very important from the humanities side that we look for the sort of coherence that seems so much more natural in the natural sciences. It's not easy, but in a sense, I'm trying to see if from a humanities perspective, we can find that sort of coherence. And that very often involves translation. Translating the terms that work well in one discipline into another discipline. For example, the word entropy, which has a very precise technical meaning, of course, in physics, I think has a powerful metaphorical usage in the humanities, which is quite well aligned with the physicists' use of the term. Maybe not perfectly, but very powerful. Yet historians very rarely talk about entropy. So I think there's wonderful possible synergies. I'll just make one more final point. E.O. Wilson famously talked about the importance of consilience as he called it. And I think his point was that after a century of extreme specialization in field after field, there's been wonderful, wonderful detailed research. And we've got to the point now where the big problems, the big questions lie between disciplines. But the structures of research and education in the modern world are designed to support specialist research. So that means that these specialist borders are becoming barriers to asking huge questions, like the question you're asking in your book. And now maybe I can turn this around. I think the question of time is an example of exactly what E.O. Wilson was talking about, that the physicists have their interpretation, the thermodynamicists have their interpretation, but then the anthropologists have their interpretation. The person who's taken a lot of LSD has another interpretation. So this seems to me, and this is one of the things I love about your treatment of time, that you are, I think, trying to bring together, taking a theme that crosses multiple disciplines and trying to merge the insights of different forms of specialization. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, very much so. And time is something that we get the feeling we still don't understand something about it until we look all this aspect of it. There's a physical aspect, there's a thermodynamical, there's a fundamental physical aspect, there's a thermodynamical aspect. There is a cosmological aspect of it, which is not the same as a physical one. There is a mental aspect of it. There is a neuro, something related to brain science aspect of it. And what we mean by time, it's a combination of all that. I think that each science brings us some knowledge. As you say, the interest, what interests us, what should interest us, and what does interest us is how this come together. I mean, it's the point of contact, and it's when we bring things together that we get some understanding. Otherwise, it's just the incoherent pieces that give us a sense of non-understanding, not a sense of understanding. And I agree with you that any bringing together is also a large picture and a larger perspective and a grand narrative in which things. I mean, in my book, I construct a history about time, in a sense, a story about time. In Italian, history and story is just one word, it's the same word, which goes from quantum gravity all the way to Proust and La Recherche. Historians are particularly good at doing history, of course, so are particularly good in bringing together many events and many pieces of information into something which has some sort of coherence. I don't think we should stick to the idea necessarily that the bringing together is from a single perspective. We can bring together a lot of information, a lot of knowledge from different perspectives without this different perspective being in contradiction with one another.
Yes.
That's the point. So I think it's if a physicist say, come on, everything is physics. It's just, some fundamental atoms or fields or whatever, and all the rest is built at that. Physics is right. If a historian says, look, there's a huge history, it is this fantastically large bird's view that goes from the origin from the Big Bang, or maybe even before the Big Bang, all the way to the problems we have today with computers or with global warming. And there's a coherent story to be told there in which complexity grows and in a sense physics is relevant here, chemistry is relevant here, biology is relevant here, sociology is relevant here, and so on, technology. If a sociologist say, wait a minute, you're just telling stories from within your culture, and I'm outside that, and I'm looking at you as somebody who look at your culture. These are different perspectives.
Yep.
They are not in contradiction.
I agree
at
completely.
all.
I agree completely.
From each we can learn. And every time there is a tension, something that doesn't work, good. We learn from trying to get over this tension, try to jump out once again and bring things together.
I agree completely, and I think that's partly the aim of my project,
Yeah.
to see if, as I sometimes think that the physicists look for grand unified theories. I sometimes think I'm looking for a grand unified story of some kind. And as my model is origin stories, traditional origin stories, which did just that. They were not literary, they were not historical, they were scientific. We often miss this, but if you look at indigenous stories, embedded in those stories, there's a lot of hard empirical science. I mean, stuff about migrations, information you need in order to hunt, in order to survive in a traditional environment. So I see this project of trying to bring together the insights of different disciplines as really a major project for thought in today's world, because we're now at a point where we can do that. We probably couldn't do it as well 50 years ago. And I think there's the possibility of huge synergies developing. For me, for example, the idea of energy, the role the idea of energy plays in many of the natural sciences is so fundamental that it makes me realize that it doesn't play as big a role as I think it should do in the work of historians. That trying to understand how energy flows work, how entropy works in the build-up of civilizations, is a project that we can only seriously undertake if, as historians, we actually try to engage reasonably seriously with the work of physicists and thermodynamicists. So that sort of crossing of borders, I think, has the power not to exclude one vision, but rather the opposite, to magnify both visions. I think rather like, this famous Earthrise, the famous Earthrise picture of 1968. It didn't actually say anything we didn't know, but it suddenly made lots of people from my generation realize that the insight that the Earth is one is not just a naive hippie fantasy. It's a simple astronomical reality. But you can only see it clearly if you get away from the surface of this planet and you see it from the moon. I mean, so it's that sort of multiple insight. And the thing you do wonderfully, which is sort of ask questions about, what the world looks like at the human scale, where we deal with these aggregates, sort of phenomena like heat, and then what it looks like from the point of view of a proton or an electron. Whereas I think the idea of heat has no meaning at that scale. So yes, I agree completely. I think it is time to build more structures that can encourage interdisciplinary research. The Santa Fe Institute, Complexity Institute, has been trying to do this for years, and they've got an astonishing concentration of talent there. But how difficult the project is institutionally is shown, I think, by the difficulties they have faced over the years. The institutions are so embedded, the institutions of specialization, that it will take a huge effort to build the new structures. But I hope that the sort of books that I think we're both trying to write will push a bit in that direction.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I guess what is much less in what I write, or is a little bit, but it's much more in what you write. There is a stronger, let me put it this way, we're told that if we do science, we should be objective.
Yes.
Do not mix value with information. Value has nothing to do with that. No question about morality and I think this is nonsense. We're humans. We're humans in whatever we do. Yeah. Your book is intensely moral in one way. I mean, it's written with a sense of responsibility, strong sense of responsibility. And the core, I mean, which comes together with a large view and the perspective and the great narrative. You say we need a narrative to know what we are and to know what we should do, what we're supposed to do. We need that. It's not.
And could I say it's partly, but maybe because of our brain structure,
because we are designed at that.
Provide a very powerful way of.
Because we are evolved like that.
Yeah.
Because I mean, once again, we can understand that in terms of biology, of chemistry, of cultural history, of everything. But we need it, and we cannot separate it. And the core, I think that the central responsibility message of science today is precisely the fact that we could function and work and survive at this point if we think at ourselves not in terms of tribes, once against the other one, but in terms of humanity as a whole, which shares problems and very serious ones to be addressed. That's very present in your book. In a sense, it's a line that drives it from the beginning to the end. And I feel that keeping science, even hard science, physics, I mean, I do quantum gravity, that's my trade, separated from that is a serious mistake.
I agree.
It's a very serious mistake.
And I think there's a simple model here, which is, I think, lawyers, barristers understand very well. Getting the hard information right is absolutely crucial. If you let moral and ethical issues steer you subtly away from a sort of careful, precise description of reality, something is going very wrong.
Yes.
But that's all true. So in that sense, objectivity matters incredibly. It's really, really important. But I think the model...
if I may, because truth itself is value, right? We value truth.
Yes.
So we don't want to hide.
But the naivety, I think, is in thinking that truth is purposeless, because we are beings with purpose. And why do we search for truth? Why do we map our surroundings? I mean, this applies to amoeba as well. They map their surroundings with purpose. And so that when I see the scientist who applies for research money and says, "Dear funders, my research is concerned to map out reality, but it has absolutely no importance or no purpose at all," then I will believe that science is completely free of moral values and ethical values. So it's a mapping project, but all mapping projects, I think, have goals. In fact, could I turn this back to you and say, what do you think is the purpose of trying, as I think you're trying to do, to give people like me a better understanding, and I think you achieve this remarkably, a better understanding of physics at the quantum level and of time at the quantum level. What do you think is the purpose of that physics? Or of your writing, rather.
Well, I went into writing a little bit by chance. Somehow I went into writing the other way around because I was so passionate to that. I saw so much beauty in the things which were coming out from the science, and I wanted to share this beauty. And the reason I see this beauty is because it's the kind of beauty when you wake up from something and you say, "Oh, I was wrong. Look, there is something else." Or you're closed in a room, and at some point you open the window and you say, "Well, there's a fantastic forest out there with flowers and butterflies and the sky. Let's go out and see." And you have your friend there who is closed inside. You say, "Come on, come here, look." Yeah. This is and looking out means to widen the perspective and see better, in my opinion. So since physics as a science is providing openings of that sort, I want to help people, or offer to people, to this opening window.
Help people see.
To see, exactly.
Yes.
And I do think that the kind of change in perspective that come from fundamental physics are major and could be relevant, could become relevant on the long term in the civilization as a whole. Time is crucial. I mean, so we learned from Newton this idea of this single, unique, eternal time that flows in this, irrespectively of everything that happens, in which we are immersed. and we learn it at school. It's not a natural idea for humanity. It's a very Newtonian one.
That was completely new to me, by the way, that Newton really established.
Newton established
this idea of...
and he found strong opposition on the continent and in the intellectual Europe of the time. Leibniz was chief of that, but it was not Leibniz, a strange idea. Leibniz was a traditionalist who was reacting against Newton's new proposal. But Newton's new proposal was so effective, so powerful. Newtonian science is unbelievably powerful. Everything we do around us today, from cameras to buildings, based on equation that Newton wrote. So it worked so well, and that was good. It gave us unbelievable, powerful tools for doing things. It's like having a weapon, fire. But it's limited. And it's limited because the world is not like that. The world is more complex. Temporalities are far more complicated things. And the more we learn this complex aspect of temporality, the better I think we can interact with the world and with ourselves.
Can I ask another question, Carlo? Which is, as a non-scientist, I have this sense of the astonishing beauty of mathematics and physics, but I also feel I'm kind of half blind, you know, so this is why I love reading books like this. So you're trying to help someone like me understand how the world functions at the quantum level. What did you find was the most difficult challenge? Because quantum physics, for the ordinary, even educated citizen, is tough stuff. What did you find the most difficult problem in trying to explain it to someone like me?
Well, technically, the two hardest things to explain are the absence of a present in the universe.
Yes, and I still don't think I've quite got my brain around that one.
And the relational aspect of quantum theory. That's very hard to explain. And maybe when we are not good at explaining something, it's because we haven't understood it all the way through. That's one. Or we haven't collectively understood it all the way through. It's not just the mathematics. I think, you know, trying to explain something like physics, as you say, well, I always have the feeling that something remains out. That's true. But I love classical music, but I'm not a musician. I don't play, I play horribly. I know that people are into music much more than me. I listen to Beethoven, I'm amazed by Beethoven. I listen to Bach, I'm amazed by Bach. But I know that people find much more than me. That's going to always be true. I read your history book. I know that your knowledge of history is enormously more than what you put in the book, obviously, right? You have a direct knowledge of an immense amount of sources. You filter it, you make it simpler to me. I get it. I know there is more, but that's fine. I mean, we are limited. We don't want to know everything. We cannot know everything. We have a little brain, which is whatever 100 billion synapses or more, but it's a teeny, teeny, teeny little thing. And I think in the same moment in which we are continuously in the quest of a larger perspective, that's what we are, because it's one of our value, try to understand. And parenthesis, I never understood the people who say there's no purpose, there is no value, there is no, we are purpose animals, we are purpose. My life is full of purpose. I want to drink, I want to eat, I want to love, I want to be loved, I want to know, I'm curious, I want to get to know you, I have too many purposes. I have to arrange them. There's nothing purposeless. What I was saying is that I think we have to accept our limitation and to accept that our grand histories are the little we have understood so far. Yeah. And I think, if I may, we shouldn't. Of course, the risk is to think that we have understood everything, and the risk is to think that the world is there for us, that we're the center of the world. I don't know, in your great narrative, for instance, it goes all the way from the Big Bang to man. of course, I'm sure you would agree, is not because the purpose of the universe was to get man. I mean, man is just one of the little things in one of the little galaxies in there. So there is the need of, I think, a crucial need of remembering that our continuous quest for a larger perspective should stay together with awareness that is always partial.
Yes, yes. Can I say, when I began this project, and it was like a question, could I teach the history of everything? And it was an experiment. I didn't know the answer, and I just started trying to do it. So one of the questions I asked myself early on was exactly this. So what perspective do I adopt? Should I try to adopt a kind of universal perspective above everything? And I quite quickly decided, no, I'm not going to do that. Because if I do a universal perspective, first, never am I going to talk about planet Earth, because it is so completely insignificant on the scale of the cosmos. I should, if I'm going to talk about the universe and try to give equal time to all the things, I'll spend, 13 and a half weeks talking about the vacuum.
Yes.
Then in the other half week I'll talk about stars and galaxies and all the stuff.
And a microsecond.
So this idea is a naive fantasy of a kind of God's eye view of the universe. So then I had this simple realization, and it again goes back to this issue of purpose, that if I'm teaching, I'm talking to human beings, so what I'm saying is like a story. And there are two components to a story. There's the story itself. Well, three components. There's the teller, there's the story, and there's the listeners. So that a story is anchored in the listeners as well as in the story itself. So that's my justification for a story that begins with a Big Bang and ends. And I may not have succeeded, but I try to make it very clear to readers. Dear reader, I hope you understand that now, we're suddenly zooming in very, very fast. And there's a reason for this. There's a reason because I'm assuming, dear reader, that you are a human being. You inhabit this planet, and therefore you're interested in this planet. And I care very much about fellow human beings and the future of the planet. So that's what I'm going to zero in on. And besides, on many issues like the nature of life, the only clues we have to the nature of life in the universe, or almost the only clues, exist on this planet. So if we want to study life, we have to study life on this planet. So I think the philosophers would call this perspectivism or something like that. You admit very clearly that you have chosen a perspective, and you then go on to justify that perspective and say, and now we're talking about purpose again, my narrative will play a useful role if I adopt this perspective. So that, for me, is the justification. Which brings me back to a methodological thing about disciplines. Because one of the problems for me was that in a world of specialization, and I think it's probably even more true in the humanities than in the natural sciences, academics spend a lot of time talking to their peers. So you publish an article that is read by, at one time I was a specialist in mid-19th century social history of the Tsarist Empire, particularly of the peasantry and particularly of their food and drink. Now, I could have listed about 8 other scholars who had some interest in that whole thing. So it's tempting to write for them, and they know a lot about this stuff. So you spend all your time trying to get every detail right. Once I started panning back and trying to write histories of humanity or the universe, the thing that made me very nervous is I know my grand generalizations are not always going to work very perfectly. You have to you have to take that risk. And I'm wondering if that was also true for you, because I think what we're trying to do is very important, because I think we're both trying to talk across disciplines and we both agree that more of this is necessary, but it's a risky and difficult thing because you end up I say things about the Big Bang. I'm a Russian historian. It's a very dangerous thing to do, but it's necessary. And in one of my books, I quoted Schrödinger, who wrote a famous book on life.
On life.
And he says at the beginning, it's a wonderful preface, he says, He says, if no one else is willing to talk about life, we need to cross disciplines. From physics, we need quantum physics, but we also need biology. If no one else is willing to take the risk of crossing the discipline, then some fool has to try, and that's me. And I feel the same
That's a
thing.
book. That's a book.
That the payoff to trying to do this may be huge.
That a book that had an enormous influence on biology.
Enormous. On Crick and Watson.
Yes, they were inspired
really
by
steered
that.
their research.
They were inspired by that. So it was. Well, I panicked when I while I was writing. No, I was happy, but in the moment when I was revising, I was happy. But the moment in which my book that only I knew about it, I had to give it to somebody else. I said, "Oh, wait a moment! I'm writing about Proust." People would just jump on me and say, "You're an idiot! Why do you say something about Marcel Proust? I mean, you don't know anything about that. I'm writing about music. You don't know about that. You're writing on neuroscience. You don't know anything about neuroscience."
I was terrified when I heard you were reading my book, because I tried to write about entropy, and I thought, oh my God, Carlo's going to slaughter me. You know? And I think one has
but
to, you know,
it's separate. I could find a line in your book and could say, oh, that's not exactly like that. But that's not the point. I mean, the point is not a single line. The story is right. The overall perspective is right. I'm sure that's something I said about Proust. There's some Proust scholars say, no, that's not the point. It's not like that. It's really like that. But the overall story is, I think it's worthwhile nevertheless.
So I think, and this is very self-congratulatory, but I think that and there are more and more scholars who I think are attempting this grand project of talking across disciplines. I think one of the requirements, because I see some scholarship whose main aim seems to be avoiding mistakes. I think one of the prerequisites for this sort of, thinking across disciplines is courage. Yeah. Actually, you take a risk with your reputation.
Yeah, but this is also true in specialization. Within a specialization,
yes.
I mean,
You're
if you look, one of my, being a physicist, like all my colleagues, one of my greatest heroes is Albert Einstein.
Yeah.
Okay, Albert Einstein has a list of achievement which is far more than what the general people know. I mean, the number of things he got right, it's unbelievable. I mean, whether his intelligence, his genius, his being in the right place at the right moment or whatever, but he has Now, the number of mistakes of Albert Einstein is far higher than most of the other scientists I know. I could list right now 10, 12 bad mistakes that he made. Mistakes in calculations, mistakes in ideas, mistakes in things that he believed and were wrong. Both mistakes that he corrected and some that he did not correct. There are some people that I say, well, this is the issue and A is right and B is wrong. And 3 years later he says, no, B is right and A is wrong.
Yeah.
And 5 years later he says, no, I was right first time. So what does it mean? He was not afraid of making mistakes. Yeah. Obviously, this is an ingredient in the success in his list of great achievement. He had no fear at all of trying something with the risk of saying it wrong. The strength of the hard science is to this great ability to correct its own mistake, try to avoid mistakes, but you don't go ahead unless you take risks. Yeah. I think is the core. It's probably true in life as well. I mean, it's just,
so that's a wonderful defense of the role of
making
error
mistakes, of
and
errors,
risk
yes.
in good research
yes.
and good scientific thinking.
As Schrödinger was saying, some fool should try, and some good will come out. Also because if you make a mistake, so what? Somebody will correct it.
Yeah.
When I read your book, then I asked. I just read the text. I didn't know anything about you. And then I asked Annabelle, where the hell this guy got educated? I mean, it doesn't fit with any... I mean, how does this intelligence, and it's not so much in the big project, it's in the little steps. You have a way of graciously finding ways out from difficult problems that it sort of is larger than any individual localized education and culture that I know. And then later I got to know that you spent some life here in Africa, in Australia. Australia already is a sort of mixing place. So I think my immediate answer would be that, at least for you, being educated and having grown up in different cultures has been an immense opening of perspective.
I think so.
I'm not sure that this is something that to the large public is easy to say. Maybe it's an invitation of go out, but people in this...
Can I try
Yeah,
my response?
please.
And then I'll ask you the same question, because you're not speaking in your native language, which I always find absolutely remarkable, and just thinking in different languages. In my own case, I think I got interested in crossing borders, intellectual borders, partly because my mother's American. She was born in Beijing. She met my father in Turkey, in Izmir, in the last year of the war. He was English. He got a job in Nigeria. So my childhood was in Nigeria. That's where I learned that very intelligent people have very different ideas about who God is or what is right or wrong. My wife is Serbian American. I am a specialist in Russia. I was a student in Leningrad in 1973 under Brezhnev.
Oh, I see.
That was like going to Mars for me, living in the Soviet Union. I now live in Australia. For several years I've been going regularly to Seoul. And I think this experience means that the idea that you can understand the world through a national prism is completely crazy to me. It doesn't work at all. So I feel very much the need for trying to bring together these different perspectives in a global vision. And for me, the linguistic thing, now you've done this so much more seriously, but I did for a time soak myself in the Russian world. My Russian is not very beautiful, but I can have a great conversation about the meaning of life, particularly after a vodka or two. But I'm also acutely aware of it. Suddenly puts me in a position of difficulty, because I'm having to recast my thoughts more in more complex ways. So the problems of translation, both literal and metaphorical, I think are very vivid to me. And the problem of translation seems very important, precisely because of all these sort of different cultural experiences. And I'd like to know if you feel the same thing, that being forced across languages, across cultures, across traditions, has played an important role in your own thinking and writing.
Yes, it has. It definitely has. I spent 10 years in the United States. I jumped out from Italy, and at the same time I have absorbed enormously from the Italian culture. I had to change languages. I now teach in French, so these are all European languages, but I've and I am well aware of the impossibility of translation, because translation is always incomplete.
Yeah, yeah.
I have always interpreted the impossibility of translation not as a signature of the separation between worlds, but of a signature of the complexity.
Yeah.
And it's not true that different cultures are not permeable. My English is far from obvious. Permeable is that they cannot communicate.
Yes.
There's no communication between because translating is difficult. It's the other way around. Culture is communication between. It's always imprecise translation, but not just between culture, between human beings. I mean, even between you and the person you love, you tell things one another, and they're not really, they don't go through exactly, they sort of go through, right? Because you never know all the way what the other person's perspective is. And even within yourself, you have debated within yourself, you don't understand yourself well. So
Yes.
communication is never perfect. But that's the nature of communication, because it is an exchange. It's pieces of information that go, and it's among people, among groups, among cultures, and the richness is exactly in the complexity. The richness is exactly in the network, in the continuous network. So for me, moving to another country, moving to another culture, having to change languages was an incredible opening of wide angle for understanding. It's also, it goes with it a little aspect of being stranger everywhere.
Yeah.
Which is fine, because after all, we are stranger at the same time everywhere in the world, even if we remain at home in the same village forever.
Can I add one thought to this, which is that we've been talking about the difficulties of communication, and I agree completely. The difficulties of communicating across cultures are simply on a spectrum which includes the difficulties of communicating with yourself. I agree completely. There is another side to this, which is that the clarity with which we humans can communicate is, I believe, orders of magnitude greater, despite the confusion and the mistranslations, than any other species we know of. The flow of information between individual birds, which are very smart creatures, or chimps or dolphins, there is a trickle of information, but it's so slow that almost as much information gets lost. So that information doesn't accumulate across generations. What makes us humans so distinct is actually the fact that despite all the mistranslations, the amount of ideas that can be communicated is so great that ideas accumulate within multiple minds from generation to generation. And that, I think, is what sets us apart, because information is what gives us control over our surroundings, and more information means more control over our surroundings. And eventually you wait long enough, and a species that can communicate this well is going to dominate its planet. And that's where we are right now.
Yes, and with risk of making damage.
Yeah,
with serious risk.
Absolutely. I said dominate. I didn't,
with all the risk that goes with it.
I have this fantasy of being woken up in a nightmare, and someone says, "Captain, we're approaching LAX airport. Are you ready to land?" I stare at all the dials and the levers, and I think, I have no idea. Do I press a button? Which dial do I look at? And I think sometimes, so I am in control of a machine with colossal power, and I have to land it. I am in control of it, but I don't really know how to land it. And I sometimes think that's the situation we humans are in right now. And we better learn very fast, because we're heading for LAX.
Right. David, thank you very much for this chat, and to the next time.
It's been absolutely delightful.